November 14th, 1942, 2:47 p.m., Factory District, Stalingrad. Lyudmila Pavlichenko pressed her cheek against the stock of her Mosin Nagant, feeling the wood grain through frozen skin that no longer registered pain. The scope's cracked lens split the world into fragments, a spider-web fracture that turned distant German uniforms into kaleidoscope ghosts. Her breath came in controlled exhalations that frosted the air for half a second before disappearing into Stalingrad's perpetual haze of brick dust and cordite. Beside her, Junior Sergeant Nikolai Belov wheezed through punctured lungs, each breath producing a wet clicking sound that meant he had maybe 20 minutes left. The sniper position, third floor of a gutted textile factory whose walls still smelled faintly of cotton and machine oil beneath the sharper stench of burnt human fat, offered a sight line across Krasnaya Street to the Wehrmacht command post. 412 meters by her calculation. She'd ranged it 3 times with her scope's mil dots, compensating for the crack that made everything slightly left of center. The wind was shifting every 30 to 40 seconds, gusting through the skeletal remains of apartment blocks, carrying the sweet rotten smell of bodies frozen in the rubble since September. Intelligence had given her 12 minutes. 12 minutes from the moment Major Yevgeny Volkov's radio crackled with confirmation that General Major Klaus von Lichtenberg was inside the command post, inspecting forward positions, presenting a propaganda opportunity for Wehrmacht photographers. 12 minutes before his convoy would depart, before the window closed, before the general returned to positions too fortified for a single rifle to reach. 12 minutes to take a shot that would save 600 men or doom them. The clock in her head showed 11 minutes, 43 seconds remaining. Her finger rested outside the trigger guard, waiting. The Mosin Nagant held 5 rounds. She would get 1 shot, maybe 2, if God and Stalin both smiled. After that, the entire German position would know her location, and the 88th Dnipro gun emplacement 2 blocks south would reduce this factory to powder inside 90 seconds. Before we continue with Lyudmila's impossible shot, take a moment to subscribe, because the next 8 seconds will redefine everything you thought you knew about courage under fire. The strategic situation surrounding this moment had been building since August, when the Wehrmacht's 6th Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had crashed into Stalingrad like a mechanized avalanche, expecting to sweep aside Soviet resistance in days. Instead, they discovered that urban warfare transformed every city block into a fortress, every factory into a labyrinth, every pile of rubble into a sniper's nest. By November, the battle had devolved into a savage room-to-room struggle where life expectancy was measured in hours and territorial gains in meters. The Red Army's 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, had developed a doctrine they called hugging the enemy, staying so close to German positions that Luftwaffe bombers couldn't strike without hitting their own men. This proximity warfare favored snipers above all other specialists. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had arrived in Stalingrad 6 weeks earlier with the 25th Rifle Division, transferred from the Odessa defense, where she'd compiled 43 confirmed kills. At 19, she was one of the youngest graduates of the Central Women's Sniper Training School, a program Stalin had authorized after discovering that female shooters often outperform males in patience and cold calculation. She'd grown up in Kiev, the daughter of a factory manager who taught her to shoot rabbits at their dacha. When war came, she'd stood in line for 3 days at the recruitment center, rejecting assignments to nursing or communications until a colonel, impressed by her shooting test scores, assigned her to sniper school. The instructors, mostly veterans of the Finnish Winter War, had been skeptical until they saw her shoot. 5 rounds, 500 meters, 5 consecutive hits on a man-sized target in a crosswind. She graduated second in her class. But Stalingrad was different from Odessa. In Odessa, she'd operated from prepared positions with reliable equipment and experienced spotters. Here, everything was improvised, scavenged, breaking. Her original rifle, a beautiful model 1891-30 with a pristine PU scope, had been destroyed 4 days ago when artillery collapsed the building she'd been using. The Mosin Nagant she held now was a replacement pulled from a dead sergeant's hands, its scope cracked by shrapnel, its barrel rifling worn from thousands of rounds. She'd test-fired it that morning, discovering it pulled 8 inches left at 400 meters and dropped 6 inches low. Not ideal, but in Stalingrad, Not ideal described everything from the weapons to the food to the expectation of survival. The intelligence intercept had come at 1:30 p.m. A German radio operator, broadcasting in the clear because he'd been trained to believe Soviet forces lacked sophisticated monitoring equipment, had transmitted that General Major von Lichtenberg would visit the Krasnaya Street command post at precisely 2:45 p.m. to inspect the 71st Infantry Division's forward positions and pose for propaganda photographs. The general was touring frontline units to boost morale after catastrophic losses in October's fighting. Wehrmacht casualty rates in Stalingrad had reached 40% in some regiments. Soldiers were calling it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, and desertion attempts were increasing. High command believed that a visit from a general, complete with iron crosses and inspiring speeches, would stiffen resolve. Soviet intelligence saw something else, an opportunity. General Major von Lichtenberg commanded the 71st Infantry Division's Reserve Regiment, the tactical reserve that would be committed if Soviet forces attempted to break out of their defensive pocket in the factory district. Eliminating him wouldn't just remove one general, it would decapitate command structure at a critical moment, potentially delaying or disrupting the counterattack that intelligence predicted would come within 48 hours. The Red Army was planning Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment of the entire German Sixth Army, and success depended on German forces remaining fixed in Stalingrad, unable to redeploy when Soviet pincers closed. Every hour of confusion, every moment of command paralysis increased the operation's chances of success. But there was a more immediate tactical consideration. The 25th Rifle Division's 3rd Battalion was holding a salient in the factory district that intelligence called untenable. 600 men occupying 3 city blocks against an enemy that outnumbered them 4-1 and possessed artillery, air support, and unlimited ammunition. The Soviets had rifles, whatever they could scavenge, and courage that was beginning to look like fatalism. Major Volkov, the battalion commander, had received orders that morning: hold the salient for 72 more hours, or the entire northern defensive line collapses. Volkov had done the mathematics. His battalion couldn't hold 72 hours. They might not hold 72 minutes when the Germans finally committed their reserve regiment, unless something disrupted German planning, unless a single rifle bullet created enough confusion to delay the assault until darkness, when Soviet reinforcements could infiltrate across the Volga under cover of night. Major Volkov had called for Lyudmila at 1:45 p.m. She'd been sleeping in the battalion command bunker, a basement beneath a destroyed school where you could still see children's drawings on the walls, faded pastoral scenes that seemed obscene in their innocence. Volkov's face was gray beneath coal dust and fatigue. He'd been awake for 63 hours straight, making decisions that killed men with every choice. Pavlichenko, he'd said, not bothering with rank or formality. We have a general, German. He'll be at the command post on Krasnaya Street from 2:45 to 2:57 p.m. 12 minutes, no more. Intelligence says his convoy won't stop longer because of sniper risk. Volkov had smiled without humor at that. After 2:57, he's gone, and tonight the Germans roll over us with their reserve regiment. Lyudmila had nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. This wasn't a regular sniping mission. This was desperation wrapped in military necessity. One shot to save 600 men. Miss, and nobody would blame her, except herself, and that blame would last the approximately 8 hours before German infantry overran their position and killed everyone. I need a spotter, she'd said. Belov. Volkov had gestured to the sergeant sitting against the wall, cleaning a PPSH-41 submachine gun. Nikolai Belov was 23 but looked 40, with a face that had forgotten how to express anything except watchful exhaustion. He'd been a schoolteacher before the war, mathematics and literature. Now he killed Germans and counted bodies. Best spotter in the battalion. He'll keep you alive until you take the shot. Belov had looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. Or we both die in the factory. Either way, it's faster than waiting for the assault. He'd stood, collected his equipment, binoculars, a notebook where he recorded environmental data, ammunition pouches that clinked with Mosin Nagant rounds. Let's go to make history or become it. They'd moved through the ruins at 2:15 p.m., 30 minutes to reach the factory and establish position. Stalingrad in November was a landscape from a fever dream. Buildings reduced to facades that swayed in the wind like theatrical sets. Streets cratered by bombs and filled with frozen debris that crunched underfoot. Brick fragments, shattered glass, personal belongings that told stories of interrupted lives. A child's shoe, a burned photograph, a teacup, miraculously intact, sitting on a pile of rubble as if waiting for someone to return and finish their tea. Bodies everywhere, German and Soviet, frozen in positions of violent death. Some had been there so long, they'd become part of the landscape, covered in snow and dust until you couldn't tell them from sandbags, until you got close enough to see the faces. The route to the factory required crossing 200 meters of open ground that the Germans had registered for artillery fire. Belov had gone first, sprinting low while Lyudmila covered from a shell hole, then reversing positions while he provided overwatch. They'd moved like that for 20 minutes, leapfrogging through the ruins, each dash a gamble that some German observer wouldn't spot them and call down fire. The cold was brutal, 18 degrees below 0 Celsius, and the wind cut through their uniforms like razors. Lyudmila's hands were numb inside her gloves, her face raw where frost had burned exposed skin. She'd stopped noticing days ago. They'd reached the factory at 2:38 p.m., 7 minutes to position, range check, and prepare. The textile factory had been bombed in September, leaving a hollow shell of brick and twisted steel. The third floor offered the best vantage, with a collapsed wall that provided both concealment and a clear line of sight to the command post. Belov had climbed first, testing each stair with his weight before committing, knowing that one rotten board could mean a 30-foot fall onto concrete and rebar. Lyudmila had followed, her rifle slung across her back, counting each step to manage fear that wanted to become panic. The position itself was barely adequate, a corner of floor that still held behind a section of collapsed wall that formed a natural hide. Piles of rubble provided additional concealment, and the sun was at their backs, critical for preventing scope glint that might give away their location. Belov had immediately set up his observation post, using binoculars to scan the command post 400 meters away. He could see German soldiers moving around, more than usual, preparing for the general's visit. Multiple officers, Belov had reported, his voice barely above a whisper, even though they were far from German positions. I count 7, maybe 8, several with iron crosses. Our general will be wearing full decoration, probably a long coat. Wehrmacht officers are vain about their appearance. Lyudmila had set up her rifle, using sandbags scavenged from the building to create a stable rest. The Mosin Nagant's bipod was missing, torn off in whatever action had killed its previous owner, so she'd improvised with rubble and a folded greatcoat. She'd chambered a round, a carefully selected armor-piercing round she'd been saving, one she'd personally inspected to ensure the bullet was properly seated and the powder charge full. At 400 meters, the 7.62 by 54 mm round would be traveling at approximately 2,300 feet per second when it hit. If it hit. The cracked scope made precise aiming difficult, and the rifle's tendency to pull left meant she'd need to hold right and high to compensate. At 2:44 p.m., Belov had stiffened. Movement. Multiple vehicles approaching the command post from the south. 3 Kubelwagens and a truck. Flags on the lead vehicle. That's our general. Lyudmila had shifted her position, pressing her eye to the scope. Through the cracked lens, she could see German soldiers snapping to attention as the vehicle stopped. Officers emerged, their movements sharp and precise, despite the cold. Wehrmacht discipline remained excellent even after months of savage combat. These were still professional soldiers, not the demoralized conscripts they'd become by war's end. Then she'd seen him. General Major Klaus von Lichtenberg, obvious by the way other officers deferred, by the Knight's Cross at his throat, by the confidence in his movement. He was tall, perhaps 50 years old, with a face that photographs would show as stern but not cruel. He'd fought in the First World War, been wounded twice, earned his Knight's Cross in France in 1940. He was a professional soldier, not a Nazi ideologue, and his men respected him. In another context, another war, Lyudmila might have felt something about killing him. He was a soldier doing his duty, not a war criminal. But context didn't exist in Stalingrad. There were only targets and threats, and von Lichtenberg was both. Target acquired, she'd whispered to Belov. Range 412 meters. Wind from the northwest, gusting, maybe 3 meters per second. Belov had been watching through his binoculars, noting details. He's surrounded by guards. I count 6 officers within 2 meters, 12 enlisted within 5 meters. You take the shot, they'll all hit the ground. You won't get a second chance. I know. The scope's cracked. Can you even aim through that? I'll manage. At 2:46 p.m., the general had disappeared into the command post, surrounded by his staff. Lyudmila had settled into position, controlling her breathing, entering the mental state her instructors called the still point, a place where fear and doubt couldn't reach, where only the shot existed. She had felt her heartbeat slow, felt the rifle become an extension of her body, felt the world narrow to the scope's field of view, and the target she couldn't yet see. Minutes had crawled past. At 2:49 p.m., Belov had made a small sound, not quite a cap, but more an intake of breath that carried meaning. Lyudmila had glanced at him, seen blood spreading across his side. He'd been hit by something, shrapnel from a distant explosion, or possibly a ricochet from fighting elsewhere in the factory district. The wound was bad, high on the left side, probably into the lung. Belov had pressed his hand against it, applied pressure, but blood leaked between his fingers. How bad? Lyudmila had asked, already knowing. Bad enough. Belov's voice was steady despite the pain. I can still spot. Just need to focus. Nikolai, don't! He'd cut her off, returning to his binoculars. We have a mission. I can die after. There. Movement. The general's coming back out. Lyudmila had looked through her scope, seeing German officers emerging from the command post. Von Lichtenberg was among them, gesturing as he spoke, likely giving orders or discussing tactics. Photographers were positioning themselves, preparing for propaganda shots. The general was smiling, remarkable that anyone could smile in Stalingrad, talking with a younger officer who looked nervous at the attention. Winds shifted, Belov reported, his voice getting thicker as blood filled his lung. Now from the west, steady at 4 meters per second. You'll need to compensate more. Lyudmila had adjusted her aim, holding further right to account for the wind, higher to account for the rifle's tendency to drop. Through the cracked scope, von Lichtenberg's face was fragmented, broken into pieces by the spiderweb fracture. She could see his knight's cross clearly, a perfect aiming point if she'd been going for center mass. But center mass meant potentially hitting the thick winter coat, the leather belt with its metal buckle, the various equipment German officers wore that might deflect a shot. Headshot was cleaner, more certain. One round through the temple or eye socket, instant death, no chance for field medics to work miracles. But headshots at 400 meters were desperate gambling, not precision shooting. The target was small, maybe 8 inches across if he was facing directly toward her, less if he turned. The wind was gusting unpredictably. The scope was damaged. The rifle pulled left. Every variable was wrong. Every calculation pointed toward missing, toward failure, toward 600 men dying when German reserves rolled through their positions tonight. At 2:52 p.m., Belov had coughed, a wet sound that sprayed blood. He was dying faster than Lyudmila had hoped. Maybe 5 minutes left, maybe less. But he kept his binoculars steady, kept observing, kept reporting. General's moving toward his vehicle, Belov whispered. 30 seconds, maybe less, before he's inside. The door will block your shot. It's now or never. Lyudmila had felt time stretch and compress simultaneously. She could see von Lichtenberg turning, saying something to an aide, beginning to move toward the Kubelwagen that would carry him away from this moment, away from the scope's cracked lens and the rifle that pulled left and the bullet that was either salvation or failure. She'd estimated the movement, calculating where he'd be in 2 seconds, 3 seconds, accounting for his stride length and direction. She'd held her breath, felt her heartbeat pause between beats, felt the rifle become perfectly still against her shoulder. The trigger pull on a Mosin Nagant required approximately 4 pounds of pressure, which sounded light until you tried to apply it smoothly while watching a moving target through a damaged scope at 400 meters in a crosswind with a dying man bleeding out beside you and 600 soldiers depending on a shot that couldn't miss. Lyudmila's finger had rested against the trigger, taking up the slack, feeling the resistance that meant another ounce would break the sear and send the bullet downrange at 2,600 feet per second toward a man who'd never know what killed him. Von Lichtenberg had paused, 1 second, perhaps two, looking back at the command post as if he'd forgotten something or wanted one last look at the positions he'd just inspected. In that pause, he'd been perfectly still, perfectly framed in Lyudmila's scope, his face turned 3/4 toward her position. She could see his eyes, even at this distance, could see the determined set of his jaw, could see everything that made him human and not just a target. She'd felt something twist in her chest, not hesitation exactly, but acknowledgement. This was murder dressed in military necessity. It was execution without trial. It was what Stalingrad had made necessary. She'd exhaled slowly, letting her breath empty completely, feeling her body settle into absolute stillness. The world had reduced to the scope's field of view, the cracked lens splitting von Lichtenberg's face into fragments that she'd mentally reassembled, compensating for the distortion, holding right for wind and high for drop and left to counter the rifle's pull. Every factor had aligned as well as they would in an imperfect world with imperfect equipment and perfect necessity. At 2:53 p.m., Lyudmila Pavlichenko had squeezed the trigger. The Mosin Nagant had slammed against her shoulder with his characteristic heavy recoil, the muzzle blast creating a cloud of brick dust that momentarily obscured vision. The crack of the shot had echoed across the ruins, announcing her position to every German within 500 meters. Lyudmila had worked the bolt without conscious thought, muscle memory ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round, already knowing she wouldn't need it, already understanding that the next 8 seconds would determine everything. Through the scope, she'd seen von Lichtenberg's head snap back, the left side of his skull exploding in a spray of bone and brain matter that was visible even at this distance. The armor-piercing round, designed to penetrate steel helmets, had passed through his temple and exited through the back of his head, carrying away everything that had made Klaus von Lichtenberg a general, a soldier, a man. He dropped instantly, not the dramatic clutching fall of movies, but the immediate collapse of a body whose strings had been cut. He'd been dead before he hit the ground. German officers had scattered, diving for cover, shouting orders, pulling weapons. The photographers had dropped their cameras and fled. Guards had surrounded the general's body, some trying futilely to render aid to a corpse, others scanning the ruins for the sniper they couldn't locate. Chaos had erupted in the command post, the carefully organized inspection dissolving into confusion and panic. "Hit," Belov had confirmed, his voice barely audible, blood bubbling from his lips. "Clean kill, center mass headshot. He's down. They're panicking." "You did it, Lyuda. You actually—" The sentence had ended in coughing, in blood, in Belov's body finally accepting what trauma had decided minutes ago. Nikolai Ivanovich Belov, 23 years old, former schoolteacher, excellent spotter, had died with his binoculars still pressed to his eyes, still observing, still doing his duty until the absolute end. Lyudmila had felt his weight slump against her, had felt the warmth of his blood soaking through her uniform, had felt rage and grief and exhaustion and triumph all competing for space in a heart that had learned to stop feeling anything months ago. But she'd been a professional, and professionals didn't grieve in the field. She checked the German position one final time, confirming that von Lichtenberg was dead, that officers were scrambling, that the 88 Lyudmila gun emplacement hadn't yet identified her location. Then she'd begun the most dangerous part of any sniper mission, exfiltration. The shot had announced her presence. Every German within hearing distance would be looking for her. Artillery would start ranging on the factory within 2 minutes. Mortars would follow within 3. She had maybe 90 seconds to vacate this position before it became a tomb. Lyudmila had grabbed her rifle, touched Belov's shoulder once in farewell, and moved. The stairs she'd climbed so carefully were navigated in a controlled fall, gravity and momentum carrying her down faster than muscles alone could manage. Behind her, she'd heard the distinctive screech of 88mm shells incoming, heard the explosions that turned the factory's 3rd floor into pulverized brick and shredded metal. She'd exited through a side entrance as the building groaned and began collapsing, sprinting across open ground while machine gun fire from German positions kicked up frozen dirt around her boots. A mortar round had landed 10 meters to her left, the blast wave throwing her sideways into a shell hole where a dead Soviet soldier had been lying since September, his body freeze-dried by the cold into a mummy that cracked when she landed on him. She'd stayed there for 30 seconds while gunfire swept the area, then sprinted again when the fire shifted, zigzagging through rubble, diving behind a destroyed tank, rolling into a drainage ditch, always moving, always calculating angles of fire and dead ground and routes that might possibly lead to survival. She'd reached Soviet lines at 3:07 p.m., 14 minutes after taking the shot, diving through a gap in the rubble barricade while the sentries shouted challenges and almost shot her before recognizing her uniform. She'd collapsed in the trench, gasping for breath, her hands shaking with adrenaline and cold and the aftermath of violence. Major Volkov had been waiting in the command bunker when she staggered in. His face was still gray, still exhausted, but something in his eyes had changed. Hope, maybe? Or just the acknowledgement that mathematics had shifted slightly in their favor. "Confirmed?" he'd asked. "Confirmed," Lyudmila had replied, her voice hoarse from breathing dust and cordite. "Von Lichtenberg is dead. Belov didn't make it." Volkov had nodded, accepting both pieces of information with the same exhausted resignation that had become his default expression. German radio is chaos. We're intercepting command traffic. They were trying to establish who's in charge of the reserve regiment now. Von Lichtenberg's second is at headquarters 10 kilometers away. He won't reach the front before dark. That buys us 12 hours, maybe more. 12 hours, not 72, not the full duration they'd been ordered to hold, but enough. Enough time for reinforcements to cross the Volga under cover of darkness. Enough time for ammunition and food to reach the salient. Enough time for exhausted men to sleep in rotation while their comrades watched the approaches. Enough time for 600 soldiers to see another dawn they hadn't expected to witness. "Belov?" Volkov had asked. "He spotted until he died. Never stopped. I need to write his family." "There's no family. They were in Kiev when the Germans came. You know what that means." Lyudmila had known. Kiev had fallen early, its Jewish population murdered in Babi Yar, its civilians starved or worked to death. Belov's family was gone, erased, becoming statistics in a war that generated millions of statistics. She'd felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking exactly, because you couldn't break what was already broken, but settling into new acceptance of what the world had become. The German assault that everyone expected that evening never came. German command, thrown into confusion by von Lichtenberg's death, spent crucial hours reorganizing, establishing chain of command, coordinating with headquarters. By the time they were ready to launch their attack, darkness had fallen, and Soviet doctrine mandated no major assaults at night when the advantage of German air superiority and artillery precision was neutralized. The attack was postponed to dawn, then postponed again when Soviet reinforcements arrived during the night, strengthening the salient's defenses enough that German commanders decided the position wasn't worth the casualties. That single rifle shot, fired at 2:53 p.m. on November 14, 1942, by a 19-year-old Ukrainian woman using a damaged rifle and a cracked scope, had delayed a German assault by 18 hours. In Stalingrad's vicious mathematics, 18 hours was enough time for situations to evolve, for plans to change, for the entire tactical picture to shift. 5 days later, on November 19th, Operation Uranus began. Soviet forces launched massive pincer attacks north and south of Stalingrad, breaking through Romanian and Italian positions that defended the Wehrmacht's flanks. Within 4 days, the Soviet pincers met at Kalach on the Don, 60 miles west of Stalingrad, trapping the entire German Sixth Army, 330,000 men, in a pocket from which they would never escape. The siege of Stalingrad had become the siege of the Sixth Army. By February 1943, General Paulus would surrender, and the war's tide would turn irreversibly. Historians debate the impact of individual actions in vast conflicts. One sniper's shot didn't change the strategic situation. Operation Uranus would have proceeded regardless of von Lichtenberg's death. But tactical actions create strategic possibilities. The 3rd Battalion's survival in the factory district prevented a German breakthrough that might have forced Soviet forces to commit reserves needed elsewhere. The 18-hour delay caused by command confusion gave Soviet forces time to position resources more effectively. Small actions accumulate into large consequences in ways that are impossible to calculate precisely, but undeniable in aggregate. Lyudmila Pavlichenko never forgot November 14th. She continued sniping throughout the Battle of Stalingrad, accumulating kills that would eventually total 309 confirmed, the highest count of any female sniper in history. But that single shot, fired through a cracked scope at a general she'd watched for 12 minutes, remained the one that haunted her dreams. Not because she regretted it, she never did, but because she understood what it represented. The moment when individual skill intersected with strategic necessity, when one person's life was weighed against 600 others, when the mathematics of warfare reduced to single rifle bullet and the seconds it took to travel 400 meters. She survived the war, became a Soviet hero, toured America promoting Soviet-American alliance, and eventually became a historian, teaching the next generation about the conflict that had consumed her youth. She never spoke publicly about Belov, about watching him die while maintaining his observation post, about the way his blood had soaked through her uniform, and how she'd felt it freeze in the cold before she'd even reached Soviet lines. Some things were too personal for history books. In 1974, 32 years after that November afternoon, Lyudmila received a letter from Germany. It came from von Lichtenberg's daughter, now 50 years old, who had spent 3 decades researching her father's death. The letter was polite, not accusatory, simply asking for confirmation. Had Lyudmila been the sniper who killed General Major von Lichtenberg on November 14, 1942? Lyudmila wrote back. Yes, she confirmed, she had fired the shot. She explained the tactical situation, the 12 minutes, the 600 soldiers, the necessity that had made murder into duty. She didn't apologize. How could she apologize for doing what had needed doing? But she acknowledged the grief, the loss, the human cost that statistics couldn't capture. Von Lichtenberg's daughter wrote back one final time. She understood, she said, or at least she was trying to. War made monsters of necessity and heroes of survivors. Her father had been a good man, trapped in a terrible situation, serving a cause that history had rightly condemned. Lyudmila, in her way, had been the same. A good person forced to commit violence that peace would have made unthinkable. They were both victims of the same war, even though they'd been on opposite sides. The correspondence ended there, but Lyudmila kept the letters in a drawer beside her medals, reading them occasionally when memories became too heavy. In those letters, she found something that victory parades and heroic citations had never provided. Acknowledgement that war's necessities didn't erase war's tragedies, that survival wasn't the same as winning, that the 12 minutes she'd spent watching a general through a cracked scope had cost something that couldn't be measured in tactical advantages or strategic outcomes. Nikolai Belov's name appears on a memorial wall in Volgograd, the city Stalingrad became after Stalin fell from favor. It's one name among thousands, a casualty of a battle that killed 2 million people. Nobody remembers him specifically except through official records that note he was killed in action, November 14, 1942, while serving as a spotter for sniper operations. The records don't mention that he died watching his target through binoculars, maintaining his post while blood filled his lungs, doing his duty until the absolute biological end. They don't record that his death bought time the same way Lyudmila's shot did, that both were necessary sacrifices in a war that consumed necessity and sacrifice as fuel for its continuation. The textile factory where Lyudmila and Belov established their sniper position was demolished in the 1950s during Stalingrad's reconstruction. The site is now a parking lot for an apartment complex where families live and children play, unaware that beneath the asphalt are fragments of brick and twisted metal, the archaeological remains of the moment when one young woman changed mathematics with a single bullet. No plaque marks the location. Nobody visits it on anniversaries. It's become what most battlefields eventually become, forgotten geography where the present built itself on top of the past without acknowledgement. But in military academies worldwide, the shot is studied. November 14th, Stalingrad, 2:53 p.m., 412 meters, cracked scope, high-value target, mission success. The details are analyzed for lessons about patience, precision, and the moral calculations of warfare. The textbooks discuss the tactical situation, the strategic implications, the 12 minutes that define success or failure. What they don't discuss, what can't be taught, is what it feels like to watch a man's head explode through a rifle scope and know you did that. You made that happen. You transformed a living human being into meat and bone fragments because 600 other human beings needed him to die. They don't teach what it means to carry that knowledge for 50 years, to see the shot in dreams, to remember the way the scope's crack split his face into fragments that you had to mentally reassemble before pulling the trigger. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974, the same year she received von Lichtenberg's daughter's letters. She was 58 years old. The official cause was stroke, but people who knew her said she'd been dying slowly since Stalingrad, that something in her had stopped functioning that November afternoon when she'd killed her 44th target and watched her spotter bleed out beside her. She was buried with full military honors in Moscow's WWII cemetery, her grave marked with a simple stone that lists her name, her dates, and the designation Hero of the Soviet Union. The 309 kills aren't mentioned. The shot that saved 600 men and possibly influenced a battle that changed the war isn't noted. Just the name and the dates, which is probably how she would have wanted it. In Stalingrad, now Volgograd, the city she helped save has become one of Russia's industrial centers, a place where factories produce tractors and chemicals instead of accommodating snipers and soldiers. The Volga River still flows past the city, still freezes in winter, still carries the weight of history in waters that once ran red with blood. On Mamayev Kurgan, the memorial complex that honors the battle's dead, there's a statue called Mother Russia Calls, an 85-meter-tall woman raising a sword toward the sky. She's meant to represent the Soviet people's heroic resistance, their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. But look closely at that statue's face, at the determination mixed with sorrow, at the strength that came from necessity rather than choice, at the expression that says victory was survival, and survival was its own kind of defeat. And you might see something of what Lyudmila Pavlichenko carried from that November afternoon. The weight of having done what needed doing, of having made mathematics work through violence, of having saved lives by taking one, and the knowledge that all the justification in the world doesn't erase the moment when you squeezed the trigger and made a man stop existing. 12 minutes, one shot, 412 meters, 600 soldiers who lived because one general died. These are the numbers that history records, the calculations that make sense of chaos. But numbers don't capture the sound of Belov's last wet breath, or the way frozen blood smelled in November air, or the weight of a rifle that pulled left but killed straight when it mattered most. In the end, Lyudmila's legacy wasn't the 309 confirmed kills or the medals that decorated her uniform. It was the terrible knowledge that she'd been excellent at something no human should ever need to be excellent at. She'd mastered the art of transforming living people into corpses at distances where you could see their faces but not hear their last words. She'd done it because her country needed it, because 600 men depended on it, because Stalingrad demanded sacrifices that peacetime morality couldn't comprehend. The 12 minutes she'd spent watching General Major von Lichtenberg through a cracked scope became a metaphor for the entire war. A narrow window of opportunity where failure meant death and success meant survival, where individual actions carried impossible weight, where 19-year-old girls became executioners because history required it. She'd squeezed the trigger at exactly the right moment, compensating for wind and damaged equipment and a rifle's tendency to pull left, making mathematics work through pure skill and desperate necessity. And then she'd lived 50 more years carrying the knowledge of what those 12 minutes had required her to become. Hero and killer, savior and murderer. A young woman who'd done the impossible and spent the rest of her life understanding that impossible things exact impossible costs. The shot that saved 600 soldiers was fired at 2:53 p.m. on November 14, 1942, by someone who never forgot the 8 seconds it took for the bullet to travel 412 meters and transform necessity into history. In those 8 seconds, Lyudmila Pavlichenko changed the war's mathematics and her own soul simultaneously, proving that victory and trauma